Peace. Good evening. My name is Ki-sang Lee, the host of the 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue. The event determines changing risk factors and discusses measures to secure individuals' safety and peace under the theme of peace and human securities. During the domestic session, we discussed the COVID-19 pandemic and peace on the Korean Peninsula. For a global session, we identify a changing security environment and will discuss internationally wide-ranging topics, such as measures on ending conflicts and issues regarding peace settlement on Korean Peninsula, with the theme of peace building and conflict transformation during the COVID-19 and beyond. The session will discuss the following. 1. State of the field. 2. Peace in a time of COVID-19. 3. What is to be done? From the 3 topics mentioned above, we will hear different opinions from different institutes. The event is live-streamed on Seoul Metropolitan Government's official YouTube channels. The video will be available on the official YouTube channel and website of the Seoul Peace Dialogue. A text message translation is provided and service is available on the digital devices you have. The event is held indoors right now, so where the strict preventive measures has been practiced. For better presentation delivery, please understand that the speakers will not be wearing the mask. First, let me introduce the participants here at the studio. Wang Jin-seo, President of the Seoul Institute. John Delury, Professor of Yonsei University, Graduate School of International Studies. Jung-in Moon, Chairman of the Inter-Korean Cooperation Committee. He will also be the moderator of today's session. And now, I would like to introduce the participants via video conference. Kevin Clements, Director of Toda Peace Institute. Welcome. Stein Tønnesen, Research Professor of Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Jenny Lilja, Director of Studies, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Muthaya Alagapa, Visiting Professor, Asian Europe Institute of University of Malaya. Charles E. Morrison, former President and Adjunct Research Fellow of East-West Center. Richard McGregor, Senior Fellow of Lowy Institute. Melly Caballero Anthony, Professor of International Relations and Head, Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies. S. Rajaranam, School of International Studies. Orville Schell, Arthur Rose Director, Center on U.S.-China Relations on Asian Society. Peter Hayes, Director of Nautilus Institute. Jonathan Powell, CEO of Intermediate. Ki B. Park, Lecturer at Harvard Medical School. Jean Lee, Director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation, Center for Korean History and Public Policy. Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Last but not least, Eun-jung Lee, Director of the Graduate School of East Asian Studies, Director of the Institute of the Korean Studies, the Free University of Berlin. Now, to officially begin the global session, Wang Jin-seo, President of the Seoul Institute, will deliver his welcome speech. Please welcome Wang Jin-seo.
안녕하십니까 여러분. Hello everyone. 서울 연구원장
Hello everyone, I am Wang Jin-seo, President of the Seoul Institute. Dear Seoul citizens, and those who are interested in peace on the Korean Peninsula, as well as all of those who are leading research on peace, I would like to express my gratitude to all of the participants.
인간 안보와 평화라는 주제로 개최되는
Human security and peace is the theme of 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this important event.
특별 세션의 사회를 맡아주신
I would also like to express my gratitude to Dr. Chung In-moon for moderating the global session, as well as Professor John Delury, who will speak in the opening remarks. The theme of this session is peace building and conflict transformation during COVID-19 and beyond.
세션에서는
In this session, we're going to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on security and peace paradigms, as well as conflict and competition between the US and China, as well as many traditional and non-traditional security threats.
또한 오랜 기간 동안
In addition,
안보와 평화
we're going to get involved in various discussions by inviting insights and wisdom from many scholars from around the world.
곳에 계신 연구자분들이
There are many peace researchers and scholars around the world who are unfortunately not able to meet in person, but we're lucky to have this virtual format where all these thinkers and scholars are getting together to share wisdom and ideas.
언택트라는
Currently, we are experiencing COVID-19, so the terms such as with corona and the non-contact services represent the changes that we're experiencing these days. Now, with corona is our reality, and in the post-COVID-19 era, we're going to have a very different world that we never had before.
그동안 국제사회가 협력하면서
In the past, the international community has been working together to build peace around the world. But now such initiatives and efforts now are put under tests.
협조해야 할 국가들이
During crisis, countries are supposed to collaborate with one another, but they've turned to nationalism and protectionism.
개발 공급을 둘러싸고
Therefore, there are some controversies over vaccine supply and development.
오랫동안 만들어왔던 국제적 협력
In addition, there have been many international cooperation frameworks that are not working very effectively during this crisis.
하지만 코로나와 같은 감염병
However, infectious diseases such as COVID-19 are something that an individual country cannot fight and win over. This is a common threat for all of us.
위기는
Therefore, threats coming from COVID-19 are what international community and the countries have to work together to overcome in a joint manner.
인류는 공동의 위기를 극복하는 과정
Fortunately, in the process of overcoming these common threats, the humanity has been able to overcome various threats in cooperation. We had the First World War. In overcoming that, we were able to create an international body. And after the Second World War, the international community created the United Nations.
함께 극복해
And by utilizing these institutions, the humanity was able to overcome various challenges. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic is being prolonged, so many governments and local governments, NGOs, and institutions and organizations are voicing the need for cooperation. And there's ever-growing importance of collaboration and sharing of experiences and ideas among different countries.
전통적으로 안보 연구는
Traditionally,
가장 큰 안보
security research
평화를 제외하는 요소로
was based on the assumption that military threats would be the key threats. But now, there is the end of the Cold War, and we have many new threats to our security, including poverty and global climate change and infectious diseases.
인간 안보 개념이 주목받기
In other words, we need to pay attention to the concept of human security.
2020년 전 세계를
In 2020, the world is going through the COVID-19 pandemic. Once again, we are reminded of the importance of putting emphasis on human security and peace building.
코로나19는 강대국과
The COVID-19 pandemic is impacting not just rich countries, but also poor countries and advanced countries and developing countries. So there are no borders
한반도는 여전히
for the pandemic.
긴장과 위험
And at the same time, the Korean Peninsula is still experiencing instability.
모색과 시도들은
We had some hopes in 2018. We still have vivid memories about them. However, now we are faced with unpredictable future.
서울은 대한민국의 중심 도시.
Seoul is the capital city of Korea.
한반도의
And for the past 70 years, we have been technically in war, but Seoul is dedicated to making peace on the Korean Peninsula in collaboration with the central government.
북한이 적대적 갈등의 전환과
The two Koreas need to overcome this division and build peace.
도시
In order to achieve this goal, it's not just the central government, but also city governments, citizens, and NGOs and other organizations that need to put together their efforts.
개발과
In the past, the Seoul city was focused on rapid industrialization and development, but in the future, Seoul city will focus on welfare, peace, and culture.
저희 서울연구원은
In this regard, the Seoul Institute will continue to do its part so that there will be more connections between citizens, NGOs, civil groups, as well as city government. And we have been conducting various research projects.
유럽, 아시아,
Here we have scholars from Europe,
세계의
Asia, and Oceania, many different regions.
인간 안보,
And these scholars are taking on research on peace and human security.
그동안 축적된 연구 성과들을 바탕으로
Based on their accumulated research expertise, I believe that they can share with us some insights on human security and peace and how we can build permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. I look forward to your insights.
연구들의 통찰력과 지혜를
The Seoul Institute is here to share our experiences with you as well.
오늘 서울 평화 대화를 시작으로
Beginning with Seoul Peace Dialogue, the Seoul Institute
기대합니다.
is wishing to create an international consortium on peace research.
전 세계적 협력의
This session is going to be our first step in building a framework for global cooperation on peace. Gandhi said
그렇게
that
하려고 먹을 때
when every one of us in the world are determined for the same objective, we'll be able to achieve peace in the world. Like what Gandhi said,
평화를 만들기로
this session is about all these people who are committed to building peace in the world. And that is why this event has been possible.
서울 시민들만이 아니라
And I also hope that Seoul Peace Dialogue will be an opportunity for not only Seoul citizens, but also citizens around the world
공감대
to share a common understanding about the possibility of building peace
오늘 모인
in the world.
연구기관이 지속적으로
And I also hope that Korean research institutes, as well as global institutes and research think tanks, will continue to collaborate to promote peace in the world.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. Thank you very much. It was welcome speech by President of Seoul Institute, Wang Jin-seok. Next, it is my great honor to introduce to you John Delury, professor of Yonsei University, who will deliver his opening remark. Please welcome Mr. John Delury.
Thank you very much. Thank you to President Seoul and the Seoul Institute and to all the people who have worked so hard here at the Seoul City to make this possible. Let me welcome everyone. You have giant faces on the screens here. It's so good to see all of you, and also welcome the audience on YouTube in Seoul and around the world, hopefully including some of my students. As President Seoul said, and as we all know, we're living in a time of great disruption. I think Tibetan Buddhists call this a bardo, an in-between space. So it's maybe no surprise that when I sat down to try to write out these thoughts as an opening for our dialogue, each time I stared at my home computer, I heard the screaming of our children fighting, making it impossible for me to concentrate. That's a familiar sound to any household, And I tried to estimate there's millions or tens or hundreds of millions of us out there locked down with our loved ones in a time when going to school has become logging into school. And I was getting frustrated, and then it occurred to me that my kids shouting might not be a distraction from our project here today, that it in fact might be the essence of what we're doing. So I stopped to listen to them argue. My 9-year-old son was making me an espresso, and our 5-year-old daughter was upset that she couldn't get to make it too. So it was a classic demand to participate. Her brother insisted it was his prerogative. First, he shouted back at her. But as she started to cry, or pretend to cry, his voice softened, and he began to reason with her. Now, all this was happening in Korean, so on my part, there was definitely a lot of information loss. I decided to do nothing, to not intervene. And when they eventually emerged from the kitchen with my son with my Nespresso in hand, my daughter was clearly still not happy, but she wasn't crying and she wasn't screaming. And I thought to myself, is this peace? I thought of Johan Galtung's definition that peace is having conflict, creatively and nonviolently. Later that evening, when I made my wife a cocktail as a reward for surviving another day, we made sure that our daughter got to carry it to her, which she did with the single-mindedness of a neurosurgeon, and we have one of those joining our dialogue. And our son didn't get upset. And I thought, is this conflict resolution? Conflict is like air and water. It's all around us. It's an essential ingredient in the recipe of being human. We engage in conflict with those we love and those we hate, with our fellow citizens and with other nations. If we were stranded alone on a deserted island, we would be left with our inner conflict. So peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather a certain way of having it. Like drinking cool, clean water instead of toxic runoff. Like breathing fresh forest air instead of factory smog. Peace research generates empirically based theories on how to do conflict in creative and nonviolent ways. Geopolitical analysis identifies where the risks of large-scale, violent, destructive conflict are most serious. And conflict mediation intervenes in ongoing conflicts or emerging ones in order to help put them on a nonviolent trajectory. And those, in a nutshell, are the 3 subject areas around which our sessions today will revolve. I hardly have to belabor these points to this group. Our dialogue brings together renowned experts in peace and conflict studies, geopolitics and international relations, and negotiation and mediation. We're bringing together academic theorists, think tank analysts, and real-world practitioners with scholarly training and practical experience from a wide array of fields: historians, political scientists, sociologists, doctors, soldiers, politicians, diplomats, journalists. We're also speaking with one another from an exhausting mix of time zones. Kevin and Charles are up way past their bedtime in New Zealand and Hawaii. Orville Shell is up well before the crack of dawn to zoom in from the Berkeley Hills. And the remainder of us are hunkered down somewhere in between: Sydney, Seoul, Singapore, Oslo, Stockholm, Berlin, London, Washington, D.C. Today's Seoul Peace Dialogue is preparing the way for next year's Seoul Peace Forum, which will be larger in scale and more directed toward an outside global audience. The Seoul Peace Forum hopes to take its place among the many global peace and security conferences already out there, from newcomers like the Paris Peace Forum to old standbys like the Munich Security Conference. Hosted here in Seoul, a short drive from the DMZ, a short flight from Beijing, Tokyo, and Vladivostok, naturally, the forum will bring a focus on the Korean Peninsula and East Asian dimensions to peace and security. But as you can see from the group we have today, the range of expertise and experience is truly global. And the aim is to explore both the regional and global sides of challenges to peacemaking and opportunities for peace building. So our dialogue today is not the starting point of a process. We are in fact joining an ongoing global conversation around advancing peace. Nor is it the end point with a specific product or outcome in mind. Our goal, as I understand it, is to listen and learn from one another, strengthening relationships among our like-minded organizations and institutions, and generating ideas for future action. The impediments to peace at a global scale can seem pretty insurmountable. The environmental crisis of climate change, the health emergency of this pandemic and maybe the next one, the ever-present shadow of nuclear war or accident. Local risks to peace and security here in Korea and around us in East Asia are just as formidable. US-China rivalry, maritime and territorial disputes, suppression of ethnic and religious minorities, hostile relations with a nuclear-armed North Korea. So while some people out there may ask, why another peace forum? And even some of you may have looked at your calendars and thought, oh no, not another webinar. I think we can all agree, in light of the gravity of the challenges we face, as well as the inescapable fact of conflict in human affairs. Really, there cannot be enough dialogue on the issues we are wrestling with today. I look forward to our session, learning from each of you and from the wisdom of our group. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was opening remark by John Delury. Now we'll begin the global session. The session is chaired by Chung-In Moon, chairman of the Inter-Korean Cooperation Committee.
Hello, how are you? Let me clarify one thing. In fact, this event was envisioned by late Mayor Park Won-soon. He was a visionary, and in fact, he asked me to set up the Seoul Peace Forum, but he passed away. And however, Dr. Seo, who is a very close friend of Mayor Park Won-soon, thought that it would be wonderful to have a Seoul Peace Dialogue as a way of preparing for Seoul Peace Forum next year. Therefore, we ventured this webinar to commemorate the late Park Won-soon. Therefore, this Seoul Peace Dialogue is dedicated to late Mayor Park Won-soon. And also, since moderator introduced you, but I have to skip it. But I think the audience, we have a lot of Seoul citizens are now watching this YouTube. Therefore, let me introduce some of you, each one of you, very briefly. Kevin Clement, he lives in New Zealand, but he's one of the leading peace scholar in the world. He's a retired professor, but he never retires. But anyhow, he's from the New Zealand. He's the director of Toda Peace Institute. And then we down left is Eun Jung Lee. Professor Eun Jung Lee is full endowed professor at the University of Berlin. She founded and in fact nourished in a Center for Korean Studies there. She has a huge building at the University of Berlin. Therefore, when you have a chance to visit Berlin, please visit her. She'll entertain you very nicely. And Jin Lee now is heading the Korea program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. But she was a journalist. She opened up Associate Press office in Pyongyang, and he had a real hard time there. But after she came back to the United States, he decided to work for the Woodrow Wilson Center. She has been doing enormous work relating to North Korea as well as Asia Pacific. Ki Park, he always looks like a very young man, but he's a neurosurgeon. Okay, he's supposed to do a lot of surgery, in surgical works, but he has been doing a lot of humanitarian business with North Korea. Now he's trying to build surgical operation rooms in North Korea with the help of World Health Organization, and he's really a pioneer in the area of humanitarian assistance to North Korea. In fact, he's one of the major person who really, that drove the State Department to change and relax some of the sanction measures in North Korea on humanitarian issues. And Jonathan Powell, he's a living legend on conflict resolution. He was a chief of staff to former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was involved in the Northern Ireland issues, and he also deeply involved in the Colombian Civil War, and also he has been doing a lot of work on North Korea nuclear issue, and most recently Afghanistan issue. Therefore, he's kind of a living witness to the conflict resolution history. Welcome, Jonathan. And Obil Shell, another living witness to the transformation of China. In fact, I learned about China after I read his book, Getting Rich is Glorious. And he's the author of that million-seller book called Getting Rich is Glorious. And he's in California at 4 o'clock in the morning. Orville? Thank you. And we have a Melly from Singapore. She's an expert on the nuclear security issues and non-traditional security issues. And also Richard McGregor from Sydney, Australia. In fact, the Asia Reckoning book, I wrote the interpretative introduction of a Korean translation of your book. It's an excellent book. A lot of diplomatic historians should be ashamed after they read your book. Anyhow, welcome addition to our Seoul Peace Dialogue. And Charles Morrison is another legend. He was the president of East-West Center in Hawaii almost more than 20 years. But finally he knew how to retire. Now he's retired, but he's still very active researcher. He was a very respected scholar on Asia-Pacific affairs a long time since. And welcome, Charles. And Muthai Alagapa. He's another legend too, okay? Muthai, are we in Kuala Lumpur or the Washington, D.C.? I cannot hear you. D.C., anyhow. He always commute between Kuala Lumpur and Washington, but he was the director of the East-West Center in Washington office, and he, published the seminal books on Asian security and nuclear issues in Asia. Again, welcome. Jenny from SIPRI, Stockholm Peace Institute. Welcome. And my old friend Stein Tennyson, he was the director of a PRIOP, Oslo Peace Research Institute, 10 years. But he hasn't retired. It's very strange. What is your retirement age in Norway? Anyhow, and another my old friend, Peter Hayes, he co-founded the Northeast Institute, and he recently completed a major project on pandemic nuclear nexus with folks in Nagasaki. Anyhow, we have a wonderful, combination of researchers here. What we'll do is this: we have a very limited time. Okay, we divided, as John Delary had notified you, that this discussion will be broken into 3 categories. First category is about state of discipline. Okay, what is the status of peace research? And second category is about what are the implications of COVID-19 on peace and war or conflict in the Asia Pacific. And third group is about what to do, okay, what actions to be taken. And we have groups. In the first group, we have Kevin, Stein, Jenny, and Muthaya. You belong to first group. We'll have about 30 minutes, okay? And second group is Charles, Richard, Melly, Obil, and Peter. You'll be talking about implications of COVID-19 on Asia Pacific. Third group is composed of Jonathan, Ki Park, Jin Lee, Ian Jung, So Wang Jin. And we'll start, and after that, when you have a group discussion, okay, we'll solely focus on group discussion. But all the 3 sessions are over, we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes to have a general discussion. So therefore, you can raise your hand if you have any comments and questions. Okay, now, we'll start the first session, okay? It's a state of discipline, okay? When you talk about peace studies, after the Vietnamese War, there was a burgeoning trend of peace studies. And as John Larry mentioned about Johann Galtung and all those leading figures in peace studies. But nowadays, the peace studies has become sunset industry, okay? Even cottage industry. Okay, why is that? Maybe Kevin, Toda Institute has been doing a lot of research on recent trend of peace studies. Would you start with what you're doing at the Toda Peace Institute?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sal. Thank you, Chung-In, and thank you all for inviting me to this webinar. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm hearing a lot of echo. Is that all right? I presented a paper, and I don't propose to read it all to you, but as Chung-In says, what was an expanding industry in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s when peace research was expanding very rapidly, there has been a kind of a shrinking and a marginalization of the field over the past, 5 years in particular. Many of the remaining peace programs, for example, that at the United States Institute for Peace, have been forced to adopt a very more state-centric security focus in order to retain their funding. And so that raises an important question about whether peace research, both in terms of research and practice, still has a distinct identity and can regain the influence it had in the 80s and 90s, when it really did have a very profound influence all around the world on conflict prevention, on conflict transformation, development and peacebuilding, and cooperative security. And there's no doubt that from when the founding fathers like Galtung and the Boldings and others founded peace research, we've had to confront some extraordinarily major challenges which have been mentioned by John and others. These include climate change, populism and nationalism, 21st century authoritarianism, the negative role of social media, national and global inequality, increasing political division and polarization, subversion of multilateral and regional organizations, the undermining of hard-won agreements on arms control and disarmament, and on top of it all, how do we deal with COVID-19 as a major global challenge? All of our theory suggests that should be a superordinate challenge which should provoke high levels of cooperation and collaboration. But it's not at all clear at the moment that this is what's happening. And indeed, as I think John mentioned, it's highly possible that there'll be a nationalist scramble for scarce vaccine resources, and the wealthy may end up benefiting from those, and the unwealthy in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and so forth may not. So the big question is whether peace research still has a role in the face of all of these different dilemmas, and what is it? Has peace research become too close to policymakers and losing its critical and normative edge? Is it too wedded to a theory of change which is based on influencing top-down decision makers, rather than kind of doing a much deeper sort of contextual approach and looking at what we might call local level, bottom-up strategies for peace? Is the field to be conceived as research for peace or research about peace? And I think this is a very interesting distinction. If it's the latter, about peace, is the conceptualization of peace encapsulated in the idea of positive peace still persuasive? And is there any agreement on what we will mean by peace, and how do we understand it? It's clear that it's always been a normative discipline. We don't want to just understand the world, but we do want to change it in a positive direction. And we have a range of values that we're seeking to represent in this field, such as nonviolence, respect for others, a general orientation towards pacifist solutions where possible, harmonious relationships, doing no harm, humanitarianism, human dignity, peace, justice, compassion, local ownership, etc., etc. And they have, I think, been the guiding principles for our field, and they underline the fact that we're essentially a norm-driven discipline. However, I think there's also widespread recognition that this discipline's got to be based on high research standards, sound methods, transparency, publicly available evidence, and commitment to putting our insight and wisdom into the public domain. There's I think, a general agreement about the importance of positive peace, and there's a whole set of efforts to try and measure these with the kind of peace continuum, the Quality Peace Project, the Many Pieces Project, Positive Peace Index, and the Inclusive Peace Projects. So I think we're beginning to really grapple with that kind of whole question of what peace means for the 21st century. But we have to work very hard to make sure that we're not captured by a kind of an old IR, hard-headed realist position. And that's why human security, as has been mentioned already, I think provides a framework that can help us bring together peace studies with this emphasis on human needs and critical security studies, and accompanied with a sort of a much broader conception of cooperative security and indeed common security of the kind that we worked very hard on in the 1980s, which also seems to have lost track of. And in all of this, we've really got to figure out ways in which we combine our research with solid practice and with solid policy advice and with strong collaboration with civil society actors. So the world of 2020, as has been noticed, is utterly chaotic. The pandemic's focused inadequacies of the global system. It's created a permissive environment for autocratic nationalism. Military expenditure is rising. There are deep conflicts over big power transitions, especially in Northeast Asia. And looming over everything are existential challenges from environmental degradation and climate change. And many of these things I've already mentioned weren't even on our agenda when Peace Research was founded, and we were mainly concerned with bipolar conflict and preventing nuclear war. So we need to focus much more attention, therefore, on what this all means for our project, but more importantly, what does it mean for the democratic project and for the Enlightenment project in general. We need new definitions of peace and security that suit the conditions of the 21st century. The non-traditional threat of pandemic is essentially kind of closed down the world as we knew it, in terms of communications and transport and tourism. So this means we have a major problem on our hands in trying to identify.
Kevin, you have 10 seconds to complete.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Goodness. Okay. My agenda is as follows then. I think we've got to focus new ways on breathing new life into multilateral and regional institutions. We've got to work with governments and UN to ensure the achievement of the SDGs by 2030. We've got to figure out how to get collaboration around existential threats of climate change and pandemics. We've got to ensure that big power rivalry is contained. We've got to develop new arms control and disarmament mechanisms to control excessive militarization. We've got to think about the interrelationships between these different problems. We've got to focus on how to outlaw aggression and violence and the concrete mechanisms that need to be developed to prosecute such behavior. We've got to reset the dangerous drifts into trade wars and mutual hostility between the US and China, seek a new denuclearization initiative on the Korean Peninsula, and work on ways of maintaining hopefulness and optimism in the face of cynicism and despair. Sorry for going on too long.
Okay, Stein. You cannot exceed more than 3 minutes, okay? Kevin enjoyed the advantage being forerunner, okay? But you will have a 3 minute so that we can have a second round. But Stein, we talked about the Johan Galtung. Johan Galtung, established Oslo Peace Institute. But there is some kind of criticism of PRIO, because now Johan Galtung's approach has been very much normative, but Oslo Peace Institute has become too scholarly, too empirical, too objective, and Oslo Peace Institute is not interested in real actions. Nobel Peace Institute handled that issue. Is that true? And you served as the director of PRIO for 10 years. How would you see the current status of your peace research at the PRIO, and what is the future direction? Within 3 minutes. Sorry.
I'm very proud of what PRIO is doing. It's true that Johan Galtung, as our founder, has criticized us. He just turned 90 on United Nations Day in October. And our veteran researcher at PRIO, Nils Petter Gleditsch, wrote an article about him, which will be the final chapter in a book I'm editing about lives in peace research, where we have interviewed people at PRIO from over the years. But I think that the academic quality that we hold at PRIO at the moment is not a weakness but a strength, and it does not preclude our normative approach to peace, where we try to come up also with policy proposals. What I would like to do now in the remaining 2 minutes is to propose some implications for peace research from the pandemic. Number one, we should take national leadership seriously. I'm not against bottom-up approaches, Kevin, but I think that we have seen in this pandemic an enormous difference in the quality of the top leaders in various countries. Some have simply not seen what's happening. Others have shown decisive leadership. We need to study leadership. And one example of this is a recent book about hotspots in internal conflict in Asia that takes leadership seriously. Number two, governance systems are affected by this. It seems that in the pandemic, well-institutionalized systems with strong states, be they authoritarian or democratic, have done well, and particularly in East Asia. While some governments that have populist elected leaders have done poorly. Third, there are now strong narrative battles between the two sides of the US-Chinese relationship about the guilt in the pandemic. These propaganda efforts from both sides are worth being studied by peace researchers themselves. Four, the fact that there are only about 30,000 deaths in all of East Asia, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia combined, but about 300,000 in Europe and soon 400,000 in North America. This accelerates the power shift from west to east. The reaction in East Asia to this transition, and also in the United States, are something we cannot leave to journalists and pure academic political scientists, but must be important topics in peace research. Then, number five, the common challenge to multilateral solutions and the crisis that we hope that the World Health Organization will get over. Multilateralism in a period with great difference between East and West must also be a topic. And then we have the boost to online communication in this period, which we as researchers experience when we have this kind of meetings. This is a momentous change in the world at the moment, where we must also look at the implications for peace. And number eight is a question I ask, and that's particularly about China. Can China combine its protective firewall with global digital integration at the same time as it's trying? This, I think, that digital question is now also a key topic to take up in peace research. Sorry that I had to do this very short, but I'm also sure I exceeded the 3 minutes. Sorry.
Yes, you exceeded 3 minutes. But as Jenny, how would you, compare your institute with the PRIO, and particularly in terms of normative orientation and theoretical orientation? What do you see the comparative advantage vis-a-vis PRIO?
Well, thank you so much, and I want to thank the organizers for setting up this extremely pertinent and timely discussion. I believe that PRIO and CIPRI are two sister institutions with a lot of exchange, and we are fully committed to the highest standards of research and remain firmly grounded in a normative basis. I would say that the field of peace research is maturing, it's growing, and it's becoming more professionalized. And what is particularly positive is that we see an increased policy demand for peace and conflict research as underpinning for policy action. But what I would say is that how we work or how we approach our job as peace researchers is perhaps one of the key points I would like to make. And this has been very much brought to the fore by the current pandemic. So we basically have to think about how we organize ourselves internally and how we can adapt to changing realities, and most importantly also to the salience of research partners that we need to collaborate with in order to get our job done. So it's about working through others and finding complementary ways of accessing respondents, or of being able to carry out surveys or questionnaires, including with populations who find themselves in the most vulnerable and conflict-exposed settings. So I would really like to flag the salience of partnerships and of strategic partnered approaches as an overall way to advance not only peace research, but also the practice of peace building. And I can give examples to that effect, but I am not sure whether I have reached my 3-minute time limit by now.
Can I add one little word to what Janne is saying? That your director, Dan Smith, he was my director at PRIO first, and then he took over after Kevin Clements as director of International Alert, and now he's director of CIPRI. I have made a long interview with him, which is published on the PRIO website, where he tells how well he liked to lead PRIO, how well he liked to lead International Alert, but how much more he likes to now be director of CIPRI. Right.
But you're not like China and the US, right? Jenny?
So now...
Between PRIO and CIPRI are not like between... The relationship between PRIO and CIPRI is not like the relationship between China and the US, right? Your corporate relations.
That's fine.
Right, that's fine. Okay. Anyhow,
We are organically integrated, as Stein succinctly put it.
Anyhow, I think they work very closely. Dan Smith used to be the head of PRIO, then moved to the SPRI. Therefore, they're personal exchanges and institutional cooperations too. But anyhow, Jenny, thank you very much for summing up to your point in less than 3 minutes. Now, Muthaya, can you give us, your view of all this study, state of discipline on peace studies in Asia Pacific, since you have been dealing with that issue, not only peace but also security?
Thank you, Changin. I would say that I don't come to this from peace studies angle. I'm really a security person, and I look at peace in the context of security. And so, to me, I think the peace studies is kind of washed away now. And maybe not, but some people here, most people here are very focused on peace studies, but I myself am focused on security and peace. I think peace studies is becoming more part of IR now, rather than a separate. And so I think the institutes that are devoted to peace are no longer relevant, I think. This may be a controversial argument, but I think it is something that I feel very strongly about. And second is, I think we need to address, I didn't know this conference is going to be devoted to coronavirus and its impact alone. I think we can deal with corona, but my view is that the other conflicts will continue. And the traditional security, what we call traditional security conflicts, will continue even after corona, after the vaccine is administered. And I think it's important to focus on those. And I think the part of the problem is the vocabulary. My paper, in fact, suggests changing discourse on vocabulary of peace research, I think. One is understanding the conflicts, internal and international. I think the combination between nation state and nation state is very important. Likewise, I think between negative peace and positive peace is also very important. And we need to move forward on both those ideas. And I think right now what I'm suggesting might seem very implausible, but then slavery and anti-slavery, the norms, international norms, how did they come about? That kind of research is necessary, and I think we've got to popularize new ideas about nation-state and nation-state, as well as negative peace and positive peace. And that's really, my take on this issue, I think. And nation-state, as you can see that there are two ways to approach nation-state. And the nation is an ethnic nation or a civic nation, but prioritizing citizenship over ethnicity is very, very important.
But Kevin, do you agree with Muthaiya's argument? Because the study of peace.
Well, that's one of the big challenges, I think, that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that peace and conflict studies to some extent is suffering negative reactions because of its success. I mean, we got things like conflict prevention and confidence building and common security and cooperative security onto the international agenda, and now and as Matthias said, it's certainly gone into hard security studies and into international relations theory and critical theory. But the big challenge is whether or not there is still something very distinctive at the heart of peace and conflict studies, which is not captured by the others. And I think it has to do with things like building community, really kind of paying attention to the revival of multilateral and regional institutions, looking at processes as much as outcomes. There are a whole variety of things, I think, which we do, which are not done by other more hard-headed sorts of orientations to these issues.
Stein, what did you take between all this, Muthaiya, the realist, and Kevin Clement, the ideal or liberal? What is your stance on that one?
I've learned a lot from all, and very much from Muthaiya Alagapa's work in the security field. As a peace researcher, I have been struggling together with other peace researchers to make us worthy also of being taken seriously by security researchers, and I think we have succeeded pretty well with that, but not by giving up our peace research orientation. But for some strange reason, peace research strikes a chord in some countries. I think definitely in South Korea. South Korea is the country I think that I had most contact with outside Scandinavia when I was PRIO director. And my big hope now is that peace research will also be taken up by more university students and professors in China, because that's so important for the future. In Europe, it's strong. In Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, hardly taken up at all in France. And in India, it's pretty strong as well. But there are other countries in Asia, like I think Malaysia, where I have not met one single person defining him or herself as a peace researcher. I have one little thing to make where I disagree with Johan Galtung, and this is on the terminology positive, negative peace. In my view, what is called negative peace, which means absence of violence or absence of war, is already positive, because war and violence are negative. So if you take away the negative, you get two negatives, and that's positive. So positive peace is already absence of violence. So therefore, I like very much that Muthaiya Alagapa in his concept paper also talked about minimum peace and maximum peace or more peace. I talk often about fragile peace and viable peace as my two different qualities. I think Johan Galtung has had an unfortunate success with that dichotomy, negative, positive peace.
Jenny, what did you take
But that's
on
also
point?
why. Sorry, can I just say this? That's also one reason why quality peace
Kevin,
and inclusive
and then
peace
Jenny.
is.
Jenny, what did you take on this debate? What did you take on this debate?
I think that it's very much a question of what empirical problems that we are trying to answer. So I don't fundamentally see a big distinction. There may be different causes of peace as compared to causes of violence. And in that sense, I do believe that we still have an underdeveloped understanding of what are the key actors, institutions, mechanisms of peace. But then I again would really like to highlight the sort of the practical aspect, and I think that's the advance, and that's the exciting part of the world that we live in today. And in that respect, I would like to go back and actually talk a little bit about the partnerships that CIPRI has, both with multilateral actors, such as the World Food Programme, now the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, where we are actually working together, trying to understand the impact that WFP has in contributing to peace within the context of its own operations. So we work together with the WFP. We are embedded in their teams. We do case studies in 13 countries where we systematically gather evidence with the ultimate aim of informing future WFP programming. So that's one exciting facet of our policy practice research. Another facet that I would like to highlight is the local partnerships that we are engaged in the Sahel, in West Africa, where we have our team has essentially built up an infrastructure of local partner organizations and research institutes, where we have then direct collaboration and means to actually go out and do interviews, do focus group discussions and surveys in really hard to access areas. And those partnerships have allowed us to actually stay grounded and be able to continue our research on peace and resilience in these very remote conflict-affected communities in spite of the COVID pandemic.
Kevin, your last remarks.
I think yes, I just want to sort of underline that there's been a lot of research recently on trying to develop indicators that kind of give us a much better understanding of what peace really means, both negatively and positively, and that's why the quality peace work and so forth is really important. And I think that we need to kind of mainstream that a bit more in terms of security thinking, because I don't think that the security specialists have really got a good grasp of what peace is apart from an absence of violence and war.
Okay, thank you very much for participating in the first group. Now we should move to the second group. Okay, second group, we'll be talking about what are the implications of COVID-19 on peace and conflict in the Asia Pacific. We'll start with Charles Morrison. Same rule will apply. You will have a maximum 3 minutes, but so that we can come up with the second and third round. Charles, I was really shocked that you didn't use the Thucydides trap like Graham Allison, but you were paying attention to, Milo's speech, the strong prevails, the weak got to suffer. I was shocked to, see your concept paper. Please.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to the previous speakers for, I thought, very interesting comment. A lot of us wrote one way or another about COVID and about how it can impact peace. But my thinking basically is that the peace is not really a result of grand vision. It's not so much, it's more piece and parts. And it usually comes out of crises. And we have in COVID a crisis that is so worldwide and moved so quickly, 4 months from the first discovery in China until it was all over the world. It really is an opportunity that should not be lost to try to strengthen the architecture globally on health issues. I think we've understood that the World Health Organization is a significant body, but it is mainly one for the exchange of information and working on specific diseases as a result of voluntary contributions. And so we need some way, I think, to ensure that we can identify diseases, and that countries have obligations, much more strict obligations, to allow teams to come in and investigate. I think also there's clearly, as already has been mentioned, a problem on the vaccine side. If we have, and the news is encouraging, how is it going to be distributed and shared? And also we had a serious problem on medical equipment, on things like masks. Immediately, countries, for very understandable reasons, put export constraints. Other countries suffered from that. And then when those restraints went off, all of a sudden there were poor quality. So that's really a World Trade Organization problem. It's one of standards and of exchange of goods at a time of crisis. We put a lot of effort in the World Trade Organization on environmental goods and services. We haven't so much on health goods and services. So let me just start with that, Chung In, and we'll move on.
Okay, now, Richard, since you have been focusing on, really China, Japan, and the United States, and how do you see the situation? Do you think that the really new Cold War was triggered by the rise of the coronavirus? Oh, sorry, I'm confused. I'm the multiple.
I did hear you. I did hear the question. So that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, I have been focusing on, as you talked about, these traditional security issues, but hearing this conversation, I'll switch slightly and then come back to that. I think we're, as we all know, in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, we're going through a fundamental turning point in the post-war era. The way that the region has been run since the 1950s is obviously over, or in the process of being over. I think COVID-19 has been particularly interesting because we've got non-traditional security issues accelerating traditional security problems. Let me first of all talk about some of the themes of non-traditional security issues. As Stein mentioned, state capacity. That's core to Chinese strength, whereas state capacity in the US has been allowed to wither in many different ways in recent years. That doesn't mean there's a particular single East Asian model. Just look at Taiwan and China, which have handled it very differently in their own ways through very different political systems. State capacity feeds into other issues, vaccines, public health systems, which have been tested in many countries. It's accelerated also the big meta trend in economic growth. China, as coming out of COVID-19 quite quickly, will now probably overtake the US as the world's largest economy 1 or 2 or 3 years earlier than predicted. That has profound implications for traditional security issues. Protectionism, which has already been accentuated during Donald Trump's administration, I think as the trend towards protectionism has been strengthened, PPEs, pharmaceuticals and the like. And I think don't underestimate confidence. Chinese confidence in their own system, declining US confidence in the US system. So all of those issues, I think, have fed into the broader and accelerated the broader traditional security problems that we're having in Asia. And really, there's nothing to sort of offset that. All the traditional, all the sort of talk shops, if you like, the Quad, BRI, East Asia Summit, ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus 6, APEC, and the like. None of them have a singularly cooperative mindset which can bring the US and China together and thus help offset the more dangerous trends. Just briefly to finish, because I don't want to go over my 3 minutes. The main, I think we were asked to sort of make suggestions. Don't make every issue a binary decision about taking sides. That's inevitable in some cases. It doesn't have to be with everything. Grab chances for cooperation. Pandemic is a perfect opportunity for that, and obviously it hasn't been taken. And try to build genuine regional forums to offset what you talked about there, about the sort of us, to quote Henry Kissinger, being in the foothills of a new Cold War. I'll finish on that point, and I can come back to other points about the Cold War issues and the like traditional security issues, if you like.
Thank you. Melly, now that's your topic, non-traditional security. Melly, can you hear me? Melly, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to sort of link my intervention within the context of this peace, security, non-traditional security, and COVID. I think what has happened, I'm speaking particularly from the context of Southeast Asia, is that what has happened with COVID is underscoring of what security is to many countries in the region. And in this case, I would like to go back to Mataya Alagapa's very important concept of comprehensive security, which we studied when I was in postgrad, and basically saying that security is not just about military security or tensions between states, but really provides all the other elements of security, political, economic, etc. But what has happened in light of a fast, interconnected global environment is that security is no longer just about state issues, but really about human security issues when, if it is not attended to, becomes a major security issue, in fact, can also aggravate interstate rivalry. So COVID is a very good example. In the context of East Asia, or South, the ASEAN Plus 3, this is not the first time that we have experienced a pandemic, right? We had SARS in 2003, H1N1, and of course the others in Korea, MERS, and all that. But this is where a non-traditional security like health security, which was a health issue, a public health issue, which in the security literature does not feature at all because it's a public health issue, has actually been, in the context of Southeast Asia, an important ingredient to peace and security. As a country is secure if it gets health insecurity in order. So as a result of what happened in SARS is that within Southeast Asia and the wider East Asia, they set up all these multilateral frameworks. So you had, a long listing of health mechanisms, right, within the ASEAN and the ASEAN Plus 3, and this explains also largely the ability of countries in East Asia to actually be prepared when COVID-19 basically broke out. And this is where all the mechanisms of cooperative security, if you like, or multilateral security cooperation came in. Having said that, it led to various other forms of security cooperation, and it basically underscored the importance of multilateral security cooperation. So in light of that, now fast forward since February when COVID-19 hit the region, we are now talking about a creating, for example, a regional centers of disease control, something that in Southeast Asia or East Asia was not thought about before. So many of this non-traditional way of thinking, of ensuring security has come to the forefront. But to follow up to what Richard has said, in spite of all this multilateral cooperation, it does not mean that the tensions between states are in a way mitigated, and we see that now within in the context of the wider Indo-Pacific, where you have lack of leadership from the U.S. and the suspicion about China and the origins of the pandemic. So all of these major tensions have come to the fore. And this is where, again, you ask yourself, can there ever be, right, a security or peace for as long as these tensions come about? But the long and short of it, of my presentation, is it is important, and going back to Kevin's point earlier, that many of these issues that have not featured in the literature, for example, public health emergencies as part, or health security as part of our thinking about what security is now coming to the fore, and not just public health issues, but also climate change. So security concept has expanded. Realist theories do not like it, but in the 21st century problems, we have to find a way to mainstream them in our scholarship and in our policy thinking. And this is where I think, as far as the field is concerned, the policy thinkers are more advanced as far as the scholars are concerned. Scholars are catching up with how security has evolved in this part of the world, and security thinking and the concept of security. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Okay.
Thank you. Obiel?
Well, it would be nice, wouldn't it, if the major impediment to peace was simply the COVID-19 epidemic. Indeed, one might have imagined that since that epidemic was a common interest and a global threat, it would have catalyzed a more peaceful, more concerted effort. But alas, it has not. And I think, of course, for those of us who are not in peace studies, but who simply worry about the state of the world and look around to see where the major tension points are, as Richard suggested, you cannot avoid the U.S. and China. And I think here, if we expect to have a peaceful world, we are going to have some sort of a resolution to that tension. But it isn't simply a tension now between the U.S. and China. It is really a tension between China and a whole host of other countries that have very different kinds of governments and value systems. And I think this really lies at the heart. This is the radioactive core of why we don't have a very tension-free and potentially very fraught world. Now, I think just to finish one thought up, I think that there's no prospect of resolving this issue or bringing about any sort of a peaceful resolution with China unless China can sort of step over its narrative of victimization and allow itself greater flexibility, greater diplomatic ability to give and take, because there is no way to resolve issues unless people compromise. And this is precisely what it has the most difficult problem doing right now, because it identifies any kind of compromise or yielding or concessions with weakness. So how do we snip through that sort of embattlement which prevents us from having any kind of a discussion where that Nixon and Kissinger had, let's say, in 1972, where we could reset the terms of the game. I hear the United States hasn't done very well lately either. I'm not sure that Biden's going to have a much easier time because of the nature of the Xi Jinping government. So I think that if you are concerned about peace, you have to look at the two major sort of players on the stage who are preventing peace. And, of course, Russia's off on the side. But I think the real threat is China, because it's a country that actually works, and it's powerful, and it's rich. And so this, for me, is really where the question of any sort of a more peaceful and less fraught world devolves on the question of what are we going to do? How are we going to reconcile with the system in the People's Republic of China that is utterly and completely antithetical to liberal democratic forms of government, as clumsy, as chaotic, and as ineffective as they sometimes are?
Peter Hayes, do you agree with Orville's observation? Without handling China-U.S. problem, there might not be a peace in Asia-Pacific.
Yes, I think we are at a very dangerous moment in what I'll call the pandemic nuclear nexus, which entails a possible increased reliance on nuclear weapons, which are the most spatially distanced weapons in the world, for reliance on conventional force, which of course is vulnerable to the virus and the effects of which could invite some states to be more aggressive. It could destabilize militaries, could incapacitate their leaders. We've already seen that with 2 supreme nuclear commanders out of the 9 in this pandemic, and could lead to instability and an increased risk of nuclear war. Now, on the other hand, it may make states more cautious, lower tension, etc. But to me, this is a far too narrow appreciation of the security stakes in the pandemic. To me, the pandemic is driving a re-spatialization of the world on the scale that was imposed by European imperialism and how that remade the world spatially, and then by the post-World War II Cold War bifurcation of the world. And this is happening driven by the pandemic at all levels, from individual, household, community, cities, provinces, national borders, in production, in consumption. I just don't think we see how radical a change is that's underway, even as we're living in it. And what we can say is that war in pandemic conditions is going to be very difficult for everyone and will pose a severe credibility issue for those who threaten to go to war at the moment on a large scale. I'm talking about the great powers here. Now, if we flip it from how COVID creates insecurity to how COVID could drive a peacemaking and conflict resolution agenda, then I think we're obliged to admit at the outset that an enormous amount really rests on U.S. The Biden policy towards China and on what they mean by COVID multilateralism as the basis for a new U.S. post-Trump foreign policy. In that context, the vaccine moment is probably the most critical, because my reading is that only when you combine American logistics with the Chinese capacity to build infrastructure in public health, global public health, can you possibly hope to deliver the vaccine on a global basis and create the capacity at a global level for public health security. Otherwise, we'll remain subject to reservoirs of pathogens, whether it's this pandemic or the next one that will be coming up fast behind it. So that, to me, is the most critical moment, but that's quickly followed by what would be a regional economic recovery and post-COVID reconstruction framework for dealing with the impacts on the economy of the pandemic. And to me, it's not clear that RCEP is the framework, and if not, what? The only other comment I just want to make, listening to our peace researcher colleagues, is that I do worry how we're all relying on our existing social capital, the trust that we have in our existing social networks that has come from working shoulder to shoulder, face to face over so many years, especially when we're dealing across borders with enemy states where people have taken great risks to get to know each other in the past Korea and to some extent China. And I'm really not sure relying just on distance contact and virtual interaction for many years. We can do it now because we're running down our social capital, but it's going to be tough to do that without meeting if the pandemics just keep on coming. I'll stop there.
Richard, do you agree with Obil that China should take more drastic measures to change itself in order to have a better relations with the United States? And also, is there any possibility the President-elect Joe Biden would come up with a much more selective engagement with China, particularly in the areas of pandemic, weapons of mass destruction, climate change, and etc.? And that kind of new relationship would help improving relationship between Beijing and Washington?
Well, there's certainly room for the Biden administration to have selective cooperation, but I would hope that selective cooperation then isn't conditioned on all manner of other issues, as perhaps it was in the Obama administration. Climate change, I think, is a good example. China, as China has shown, has ample incentive itself to work on climate change with or without cooperation from the United States. Obviously, it's much better if the two do cooperate. On the general policy framework, there's been a spate of articles since the election of Mr. Biden about what he can do to reach out to China. We read almost nothing about what Xi Jinping could do to reach out or change policy to reach out to the United States. It won't matter what the Biden administration does unless there is also a change of policy in China. And I think that's quite difficult at the moment because I think Chinese foreign policy is essentially set by internal politics, by the China dream, the great rejuvenation of the nation. China is set on a course, as it may well decide to do, with ambitions in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, in the East China Sea. India is a little bit separate. And if China continues to roll in a singular way down that track, be it fast or slow, it's very difficult, number one, to see how we get there without conflict. The US is in relative decline, but I don't think it's going to sort of disappear across the Western Pacific in some sort of bourgeois decline. Or secondly, the region will be a very unhappy place with a single Chinese hegemon. So I think, we need to see changes in China under Xi Jinping at the moment. That's very difficult.
Obiel, do you agree with Richard? But if you listen to Henry Kissinger, and he said that the Cold War should be avoided and also can be avoided. Do you agree with Dr. Kissinger's observation?
Well, I think Dr. Kissinger is a bit excessively optimistic, having told us we are in the foothills of the Cold War, to suggest that it can be avoided. I'm not so sure. Of course, I'd love to see it avoided. But, I think that the real problem is that when you talk with Chinese counterparts, it's always, what can the United States do? What's the United States' fault? And the United States has fault, there's no doubt about it. You get utter silence when you ask, where has China been wrong? Where has China been excessive? Where might China make some amendments to its policy? So I think short of that, as Richard said, I don't see any sort of a resolution. And indeed, the pandemic, it's sort of like a cosmic confirmation of our decoupling, which isn't just in trade and investment. It's in every single aspect of our existence, from scholarly relations to media, to music, to art, to culture. And this is creating an incomparable loss, because this musculature is dwindling between China and countries like Australia, countries, all around the world. at the same time that it's very active, aggressive, and successful as a marketplace and Belt and Road with the AIIB, things like that. So it's a tremendous paradox. And if China was simply Russia, a technocratic military state with certain expansionist intentions, then you wouldn't worry so much. But it is an economic powerhouse. We've never experienced anything like this in the past. So how we deal with that challenge is at the center of any discussion of peace, in my view. And I don't have an answer for it because I don't, like Richard, I don't see Xi Jinping changing.
Charles, do you share Obil's pessimism?
Yeah, I pretty much do. I don't worry about a hot war. I do worry about a cold war. I do think the leadership in both China and the U.S. has been very problematic in recent years. One difference is that we got rid of our leader, or are in the process of doing so, and the Chinese have not. But I think there are some more fundamental things. One is how we look at power. And the American Revolution was based on fear of concentrated power at the center level. And so we have the federal system, we have the checks and balances, we have the two houses of Congress, and it makes our system difficult in dealing with anything except typically good leadership and emergency. In the Chinese historical experience, I think, is probably just the opposite. Many borders, periodic invasions. When China was divided, China was weak, and so it kind of tends to give a different orientation toward the Chinese. And then the other thing I think that we have to remember is that when we talk about international institutions, many of them were created in the transatlantic world shortly after the end of the World War II. And they're basically rooted in long traditions of Western philosophy and experience. And a lot of non-Western nations have embraced some of the concepts, but they don't have that same experience behind them. And so they don't embed them in the same way. And that is frequently, I think, a tension in relationships of Western and non-Western countries, and particularly China and the U.S. What I see is a period ahead of hard bargaining, kind of practical steps. But I think it's in the interest of both countries to work with each other, and I'm hopeful that that something like that can happen. Maybe not in the next 2 or 3 years, but over time. We obviously have to work with each other in order for each of us to have security and peace.
Melly, what is the ASEAN position? Which side are you taking? Are you trying to balance between the two, or? But I heard the rumor that ASEAN is taking side with the United States, turning against China. Is it true?
Well, the official answer that you would get from diplomats is that we never choose between U.S. and China. And choosing one is dangerous because as far as the region is concerned, it's always been very careful about playing this, a game between choosing the liberal or the illiberal world. Now, in the experience of Southeast Asia, as you know, they have the ASEAN, and ASEAN has been, since the 1990s, especially at the end of the Cold War, one of the first builders of multilateral institutions. That's why it decided to establish what they call ASEAN-led institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN +3, and in 2005, the East Asia Summit, which basically brought together all these major powers in a framework where you're supposed to encourage habits of cooperation and confidence building, etc. So the position of ASEAN has been that you should as much as possible not divide the world, make it a more inclusive form of cooperation between which brings together like-minded and non-like-minded states. Now, at the practical level, there are of course a lot of concern about the aggressiveness of China. You can see, for example, that under the shadow of COVID, there was China's aggression in the South China Sea was most visible in April of this year. And in that respect, ASEAN, to some observers, has really not been strong enough to call out China. And at the same time, it also does not want to be seen as antagonizing China. So it's really caught in this difficult position. And what it tries to do, to the extent possible, is to sort of strike what they call some kind of strategic autonomy, if you like, by being drawn to neither powers, but instead focusing on in the context of a highly charged security and political environment, bring down the temperature and focus on functional cooperation. And this is where, when you look at a COVID-19 world, it's not that bad, actually. When you think about COVID as transforming our way of life, well, there will be some who will say that, pandemic is something that has happened, that will happen, but for as long as you have the right mechanisms and the right practices, for example, pandemic preparedness, at the same time, being mindful of observing the new norms in international health and international health regulations, like mandatory reporting of infectious diseases. And this is where I think regional forums can weigh on China, and ASEAN has done that, to be more transparent when it comes to outbreaks of pandemics, because this then, if failing that, then you really have the world basically closing down as a result of this. So ASEAN has been very careful in in maintaining dialogues, the JoJo versus war kind of thing, but at the same time really coming up with more, more visible areas of cooperation. This has been the ASEAN position all this while.
Thank you. Now we finished the Group 2 discussion. Now we are getting to Group 3 discussion. Thank you very much for waiting so long time. Jonathan, and we have discovered that Asia Pacific is full of conflict. And we need your remedial solutions. We need your magic touch so that we can resolve all those conflicts. Please, what is your take on that?
I'm afraid I don't think I have a magic answer, but let me talk about some of the changes that might have an impact in the region. But firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I'm a mere practitioner, not a scholar like all of those who've spoken before. The things I've observed are, firstly, there's much less inclination to have mediators in peace processes now. If you look at Ethiopia at the moment, Prime Minister Abiy has rejected the idea of a mediator. North Korea was very unkeen on anyone mediating between them and the United States. In Colombia, there was no mediator. In Afghanistan, there's no mediator. So to work on peace, we need to find out more imaginative ways of doing it. And increasingly, that's a matter for individuals, for NGOs, and particularly for the establishment of back channels, building channels secretly between sides that can make advances. And I think that's the thing we need to try and concentrate on. How do you have virtual mediation? Can you have advisors from both sides, as we had in Colombia, working on transitional justice, working together to get to peace? The second change I've seen is prevention, the focus on prevention rather than ending armed conflicts after they've begun. But I'm afraid to say it is not enormously successful. Again, if we look at Ethiopia, many people have called for progress on talks, but instead we're plunged into a hot war. In Venezuela, people have been trying to work to prevent an armed conflict, and so far there hasn't been an armed conflict, but there is a real conflict in which people are suffering, and prevention, which the EU in particular is focusing on, has not necessarily succeeded. The third thing I observed is the withdrawal of the United States, pulling back under President Trump. So in Syria or in Libya, there is no US role. And without that US role, other players come in, like Turkey and Russia, to try and solve them. Of course, that may change with President Biden coming in. Fourthly, the role of China. You've been talking about the tension, obviously, between China and the United States. But one unremarked on thing is the way that China itself has tried to play a role as mediator in Afghanistan and in Burma and elsewhere. It has generally done so in a rather cack-handed and unfortunate way, but it's interesting it's trying to move into this field of mediation itself. And I think all of this applies to your own conflict, and I'm glad we're doing this in Seoul virtually, because it seems to me that is a real focus of peace. And I think in terms of North Korea, the things that I've talked about will have an impact. A new President Biden will have a different approach from President Trump. He may well not be so committed to all in one go as President Trump was for solving North Korea, but more willing to look at doing it step by step. We need to look at back channels because of the North Korean reluctance to engage. How do we actually get engagement between the United States and North Korea? And I think we have to look at China too, because if a Biden administration is trying a slightly new approach to China, they can't avoid talking about North Korea. That will not solve North Korea, but it will give us a new way of trying to deal with it. And lastly, in my 3 minutes, I just want to say one thing I've learned from 20-odd years now of working on conflicts is that just because you don't succeed the first time does not mean you won't succeed if you keep trying. In Northern Ireland, we had 4 attempts at peace, and it was only the last one that succeeded. Likewise in Colombia, likewise in Mozambique. And I strongly believe that in North Korea, if President Moon keeps applying himself, if a new US administration applies itself, there is the possibility of getting to a peaceful solution, however depressed we may be about progress so far. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some, people here who have done the endless effort toward North Korea. Here is Ki Park. Okay, Ki, would you tell us of your experience, and would you tell us what should be done in dealing with North Korea, particularly with regard to the pandemic, since you're a medical doctor?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Moon. I want to make just a brief comment about this overall health, peace, the discussion. One is this positive and negative definition of peace. And we have the same challenge within the definition of health. So we say, and at least WHO's definition of health is it's a complete state of well-being in 3 dimensions: physical, mental, and social, and not just the lack of illness. And so in some ways, there's this sort of a similarity in peace. I do think that it's a continuum, and lack of conflict doesn't mean there's peace. And then, I'm a surgeon, as you know, I'm a neurosurgeon. And in health, we're like the ones that are on the battlegrounds. We're the soldiers. We're the ones that are sort of the grunts. And we're actually, then I left, I'm still a neurosurgeon, but I went back to school and became a public health practitioner. And if you talk to surgeons, at least a couple of decades back, they say if you want to go into public health, they thought you were kind of not serious about surgery. And I suspect, and that's changed a lot, because now we have a huge numbers of surgeons who actually are now practicing public health. I suspect there's something similar, that the relationship between sort of the hardcore international relations people and then peace researchers. And I think there needs to be a connection between those 2 communities. And then in the context of this current pandemic, I think it has completely upended the traditional thinking. It really has made people, at least governments, self-reflect on what should be their priorities, because as people have mentioned, military spending has been going up. I tell you, not a bullet or even a nuclear missile cannot stop a single virus. It is completely defenseless against that. And then it has to be a reset, a great reset regarding how governments prioritize human security and where they allocate their money. I hope in the future that the budgets for public health spending and human security are at least as in par with military spending. I know I'm being very optimistic. And let's talk about North Korea in specific context. We already have seen how the leaders of these U.S., North Korea, and South Korea have already been communicating because within the pandemic, because within global health security, the security is as good as the weakest link. No one is safe until we're all safe. So you saw letters going back and forth between U.S. to North Korea to South Korea. So there's this willingness to cooperate and put down some of the animosities and have adversaries work together. So I do have some specific recommendations on what could happen. I think there needs to be a large reset in how we approach human security and the Korean Peninsula, specifically North Korea. I think it needs to be comprehensive. As you know, right now, there's lots of banking channel, customs issues, or logistical issues, and it has to be completely overhauled. Sanctions has to be rolled back at some level, at least to allow large-scale humanitarian activities to continue. And there has to be a multi-stakeholder approach for multiple reasons. One for political continuity. And the package, whatever the package we have offering North Korea, and I agree with Peter Hayes on this thing. It needs to be a large enough package. It has to be unprecedented to get their attention. And from a tactical standpoint, we should operationalize this by focusing on pandemic preparedness, provision of massive testing, large amounts of medical countermeasures. And here's the key. The discussion has to be about COVID vaccine. Without providing North Koreans an assurance that they will have full access to the COVID vaccine, this is where they need assurance. They're afraid. This has to be a key component of whatever re-engagement we have with North Korea.
Thank you, Key. Jean, what did you take? You have been doing a lot of works on North Korea too, but it's not easy for you to do work with North Korea, particularly in Washington, because all kinds of sanctions and restrictions. Jean, would you tell us, your experience and what to be done? Jean, we cannot hear you. Would you check whether you have a mute or not? Very strange. Okay, Jean, we'll come back later. Okay, why don't you fix your problem? Okay, 이은정 교수님께서는
So, Professor Lee,
한국말로 하시는 게 더
I understand that you find Korean more comfortable because we are not here on a German language setting, so perhaps we can hear from you. Professor Lee is working at the Free University of Berlin, and you've had a very good role because you've invited 12 students from the Kim Il-sung University together with other South Korean students. And I understand that you had a very meaningful opportunity last year in December, I believe, and you said that there was not much of a difference between North Korea and South Korea. So can you tell us about that and also tell us about the situation in Europe? How are Europeans approaching the North Korea issue? Can you tell us a little bit about that and what kind of action we should take here from our end?
제가 지금 두 가지 질문을 선생님이 하셨는데요.
I think, sir, you asked me two questions. So, first of all, you asked me about that experience that I had inviting students from Kim Il-sung University to Berlin, and also what the Free University of Berlin is doing and what Berlin is doing as a whole in regards to approaching North Korea policy regarding North Korea. So, I would like to address your first question. We did invite some students from the Kim Il-sung University in North Korea to Berlin to study Berlin German culture and the German language. We were able to do that because the Free University of Berlin and the Kim Il-sung University have an understanding on student exchange. So we already had that partnership in place. In fact, this partnership began from 2011 to 2019. In fact, up until last year, when we've invited those students over to Berlin. And that was last year's scholarship program. The student exchange was a fruit of those results. There was also some results on the parts of various German institutions, including the German Foreign Ministry, for example. So there were many of those efforts that led up to that. This was an opportunity for cultural exchange. The fact that schools work together to facilitate cultural exchange for students was, I think, very meaningful.
모든 것들이 북한 문제가 나온다면, 한반도 문제가 나온다면 모든 것이 북한 문제로.
I think when people talk about North Korea, people often just zoom straight into denuclearization and nuclear energy. But I think that the opportunity for us to have that cultural exchange was really eye-opening because we took that as an opportunity to sort of shift the focus away from just denuclearization and nuclear weapons to an entirely new sector.
우리가 굉장히 의아하게 생각을 했었고 그 부분에 대해서
I think that was also an eye-opener for a lot of other people in Berlin.
독일 연방 정부에 대해서 문제를 비교가 맞습니다. 일단은 그 이유는 독일과 유럽의 역사를 볼 때
If we take a look at the history of Germany and Europe,
평화 정착에
many civil societies work very actively in the peace process and the peace building process. I'm sorry, the sound quality is very poor, the audio quality is very poor, and simultaneous interpretation services are very difficult right now. So I think that civil society organizations post-war had the opportunity to play their individual roles to try to facilitate the peace process.
하지 않는 것이 아니라 연방정부가 그런 역할을 허용해주지 않는 것이 아니냐라는 생각을 저희가 하고 있었습니다. 그래서
we thought that if we look at these historical experiences of Europe as a whole,
유럽의 경험을 한반도에 시사해주는
perhaps these European experiences of really allowing civil society actors to participate in the peace building process can have some implications for the Korean Peninsula as well.
그런 의미에서 우리가 지금 다양한 시민단체들.
Which is why I think that it's very imperative upon us to really involve think tanks and civil society actors, so these other different actors, to try to involve themselves in the peace building process, because that can allow us to see these new changes that we might not otherwise see. We can bring in those participation from other actors and have their voices be heard. Because that was really important for us in the Berlin case when we invited students, because we focused on other areas like cultural exchange or language exchange. So it doesn't always have to be talking about denuclearization or nuclear weapons. And maybe we can even expand that further to talk about environmental issues or climate change or other various concerns that are impacting humanity. No, we don't have to completely be immersed and stuck in the mindset of denuclearization. So that is the effort that we've made on the part of the Free University of Berlin. And that was the goal that we had in mind when we invited those students over from North Korea, from the Kim Il-sung University.
Can you use your audio yet?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, excellent. Please go ahead.
So what I was going to say that as a journalist covering Korea, both North Korea and South Korea, North Korea is of course the biggest challenge. It is the biggest challenge for any foreign correspondent. I, in my 20-year career, covered many challenging assignments, but North Korea was the most challenging. And part of it is that we know so little about them. It's difficult to get access to them. It's difficult to wade through the propaganda, understand what is significant, what is real. And so it takes many years for any journalist to truly understand what this country is about. And of course, if you don't have access on the ground, it's even more complicated. So my mission was to find a way, as an American journalist, as a Korean American journalist, so there are many layers, as a woman, and many layers of challenges, to try to do something that no other journalists had done, no other American journalists had done, and that was to get to North Korea. But one thing that was very interesting when I started this journey and started these negotiations was, you have to use every tool that you have. What I find so fascinating about this forum is that you're bringing together all these brilliant minds. We are kind of learning so much from what I've heard today, and that with a Seoul Peace Forum, you would be able to bring all of that to bear on the Korean Peninsula, where these issues of peace and security are really, truly pressing, but for us to also find ways to apply that to North Korea. Because what I found was that as a journalist seeking to get on the ground and to connect with the North Koreans, to understand that story, I had to use every tool that I had. As a woman, as an ethnic Korean, as an American, even though those were challenges. And I would say that in some ways, even the terms that we're discussing, peace and security, in some ways those are defined differently inside North Korea. And that's important to understand that they have a different value system. They have a different political system. They have a different way of engaging with the world. And it's up to us to try to understand how to speak to them, how to reach them, how to get to them. One of the things that I noticed as bureau chief for the AP, I ran both the Seoul bureaus, and of course I negotiated the opening of the Pyongyang bureau. You have different vocabularies in South Korea and North Korea. One of the words we hear so often, which I love about South Korea, is 희망, hope. You hear that so often in vocabulary, in titles, in conference names. There's such a sense of optimism, which I think has really, truly driven South Korea's success. It's a word that we hear very rarely in North Korea, and I found that so demoralizing in some ways, because it made me wonder what is it about their view of the future that they don't use the word hope. 희망 is a word I did not hear very often in North Korea. How do we reach them and instill that sense of hope and optimism in the future? One of the major concerns I have right now, the nuclear threat with North Korea certainly has not subsided. I would argue that it has become exponentially worse over the past 4 years. But even the added layer and the complication that COVID presents, it brings another layer of complication, because how North Korea has responded to COVID is to retreat into a self-imposed isolation. That means that we have less access to them and they have less access to us. I think that there are some very promising things happening right now. The fact that we will have a new president in the White House, a president who has prioritized repairing relationships, repairing alliances in the region is very, very important, because when it comes to North Korea, I think having somewhat of a united stance, coordinating, consulting, acting in concert is extremely important. Not giving them the chance to play a game of divide and conquer, which is what they prefer, because they prefer to be able to control those relationships. So perhaps, as Jonathan Powell mentioned, it might be the use of mediators, but I would say that it's making sure that all the stakeholders in the region have a chance to express both their needs and their wants. But as well, I think in President-elect Biden's commitment to principled diplomacy. You know, I talk a lot about how when I worked with the North Koreans, I'm not sure that we have a phrase of principled journalism, but it was principled engagement, making sure that we're constantly reaching out, serving as a bridge, making myself available to serve as a bridge to the outside world, but being tough at every step, making sure that I didn't sacrifice my own principles or the news industry's principles in reaching out to them. And so I think that that's very important, and that's very good for long-term engagement. And so these are things that I see as being very promising, even though it looks so bleak. And even though I think we'll have to wait to see what Kim Jong-un himself decides after assessing the situation, both with this new presidency in the White House and with COVID. And we should get some sense after or at the Party Congress in North Korea in 2021, what direction that will take. But I think there's promise. I'm not sure. I know, Professor Moon, you might want to get to what can we do, and I hope we'll get to that discussion as well, because I think there are many people who will have some ideas on how to be proactive and prepared for that time when North Korea does choose to come out of its isolation.
Thank you, Jane. Last but not the least, let me invite Dr. 소왕진, we're speaking in Korean. 그러니까 지금 우선 저 서울시에서 그동안 했던 간단히 이 주제에
Can you
관련해서
tell us a little bit about the City of Seoul's efforts towards advancing this cause and what kind of plans you have?
예, 앞에서 많은 분들이 말씀을 하셨지만
As many people have already said before this,
한 개인이
COVID-19
도시가 또 한 국가가 아무리 철저하게
hits us all
하더라도 그 문제를 제대로
without distinction, even if an individual or a city or a country has tried to really work hard to protect ourselves because the world is so interconnected, it's very important for us to engage in a communication and solidarity.
사실은 이
I think in the case of the city of Seoul,
그래서 가장 인구가 집중되어 있는 대도시이기 때문에
COVID-19,
가장
when it hit Seoul, it was very difficult for us because we're a very densely populated city, so there was a possibility for the outbreak to really hit us very hard. But the central government and the local government here in Seoul worked very actively. It worked very proactively, in fact. So many people have praised the efforts of both the Seoul Metropolitan Government and the central government.
세계 주요
From
도시의
January to June
온라인으로
this year,
초청을
we
해서
had the opportunity to invite mayors of cities for Cities Against COVID-19 Global Summit, CAAP. We were able to organize this summit in a very short period of time to share the experiences of not just Seoul, but of other cities across the world on how we responded to COVID-19. And through this summit, which was attended by the former mayor, Park Won-soon, and the Cities Alliance Against Pandemic, he presented the initiative of an international organization of cities allied against COVID-19 or pandemics. So 42 different cities adopted a Seoul Declaration. And if you take a look at the Seoul Declaration, they talk about how we can have effective multilateral cooperation at the city level, maybe on information exchange on infectious diseases or pandemics. And when there is a pandemic, how we can have citywide urgent response in terms of human-to-human and material exchange, and what cities are going to do to try to build capacity for professional talent. There is going to be a lot of socioeconomic impact because of a pandemic, but the cities agree to try to open up its doors and try to engage in more cooperation and exchange so that we can all together overcome the pandemic in a short period of time. So those were the contents of the Seoul Declaration. This means that city-level cooperation against pandemics is possible, and it's very important. 1 month after this Seoul Declaration was adopted, when we took a look at the website, many healthcare professionals and government officials had seen this. About 25 million views of this Seoul Declaration in a very short period of time. So this is a testament to the level of interest. However, the former mayor Park Won-soon passed away just 1 month after the adoption of the Seoul Declaration. So that led to some challenges. But the city governments of Seoul still are committed to these efforts, and we're going to continue to upgrade our efforts going forward. And just one more thing, if I may, is that Seoul as a city will ally itself with many different city alliances across the world, but we also understand that the North Korean issue is very important for us as a city, which is why we also made an attempt in that regard. I think you all would know very well, but these economic sanctions and the different UN sanctions placed on North Korea have been a big challenge for the DPRK. And because of COVID-19, they have engaged in further isolationism, which means that many of its residents, including the elderly and children, are really faced with a very drastic situation. And so in overcoming that situation, Korea and Seoul should not ignore that problem. So we wanted to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea. And this was an initiative that Seoul had agreed to. But as you know, there are those very strong UN sanctions in place. However, humanitarian assistance is not included in the umbrella of the sanctions regime, which is why, as the first local government in Korea, we have decided to provide diagnostic kits and various other equipment to send them to the DPRK. So we have requested this, and We're going to make use of UNICEF as a mechanism. We will receive support from UNICEF. We have signed an MOU with UNICEF. And in February, we have sent about funding of the $300,000 to UNICEF so that UNICEF can make use of that funding to provide PPE and other diagnostic kits to the DPRK. If we take a look at all of these different experiences in the response to COVID-19, inter-Korean cooperation and the participation of local governments and even NGOs and private organizations will allow for a broader scope of cooperation with the DPRK. Thank you very much.
General discussion. You can raise whatever questions, but we would be very much interested in the agenda for action in the future. And as you know, this Seoul Peace Dialogue is kind of prelude to next year's Seoul Peace Forum. And I understand that the Woodrow Wilson Center, University of Berlin, Harvard Medical School, and Intermediate, and then Melis Institute and East-West Center, Asia Society, Lowy Institute, Nautilus Institute, Toda Peace Institute, CIPRI, PRIO, and Muthaya. What is your affiliation?
University of Malaya, but I'm here in Washington, D.C.
Okay, and University of Malaya, the ASEAN representative, and therefore you will all be stakeholders for the next year's Seoul Peace Forum. With this assumption, let us talk about an agenda for action and some major themes for the next year. For example, Jonathan, you proposed the idea of setting up the Regional Center for Conflict Resolution, but you haven't really addressed while you're giving a talk. Can you elaborate on that idea?
I can hear you.
Go ahead, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Many years ago, many decades ago, I worked on the CSE negotiations in Europe that brought together all the nations of the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and actually played an important role in bringing down the Berlin Wall and the changes in Europe that brought unity to Europe. And I think there's a case for your part of the world too, having something like a CSE structure, and by having something in Seoul that could generate the ideas for that, it might be possible to plant the germ of such a regional security dialogue, starting from something with NGOs and academics in Seoul that could grow into a bigger forum between governments.
I think that, but that is one of the intentions of, Seoul City to organize this Seoul Peace Forum, But I think that would be a wonderful idea, and we can institutionalize that kind of dialogue every year in Seoul. Peter, you talked about the nuclear pandemic nexus, and also you have been proposing this, Northeast Asian Public Health Initiative. Can you elaborate on that a little bit so that there can be kind of an agenda for next year's, Seoul Peace Forum?
Sure. Well, at the moment, W, of course, is working in the West Pacific and East Asia region, but it's a relatively weak structure, and it needs tremendous infusion of funding and expertise. And I don't think that it's really capable of responding to the needs driven by the pandemic, which really doesn't pay much attention to what we care about. What it cares about is infecting humans. So the imperative for cooperation in the region in terms of sharing best practice, sharing material, sharing vaccine, sharing training, increased access and transparency so that you know what's coming down the pipeline. There's just an enormous agenda for cooperation in Northeast Asia to increase public health security. Now, that is something that should be done irrespective of North Korea, But if we think about North Korea as a black hole and as a potential reservoir of various public health risks, not just this pandemic, but there are quite a few actual diseases in North Korea. But we also look at North Korea as a potential contributor to the public good. Then engaging North Korea is, as one of the previous speakers said, absolutely necessary for the global good, because you can't have a black hole where the virus is free to come and go at will. You've got to integrate North Korea into that public health network, that public health infrastructure. Very simple things could be done. For example, the Tuman wetlands is one of the world's great transmission belts for the avian viruses. All the different birds in the East Asian Beltway that fly from down here in Australia all the way to Korea, then on into into Siberia. Some of them fly all the way from East Asia to the United States and back. That goes right through North Korea. Now, other countries in the region, Indonesia, Vietnam, China, Russia and the Far East, all have laboratories where they collect samples from these birds to monitor the transmission over these migratory routes. North Korea does not. That's the kind of scientific project where they can become contributors to the global public good, and we gain some access and we start to engage them on these kinds of issues.
Peter,
so it really, I think...
We are not excluding North Korea. President Moon Jae-in proposed Northeast Asian Public Health Initiative. We extend the invitation to Pyongyang, but no response. Key Park, you have been dealing with North Korea for a long time. Would North Korea respond positively to President Moon Jae-in's Northeast Asian Public Health Initiative?
In the short answer, no. And let me elaborate. It would be a terrible mistake at this point for us to decide on doing a project or two in North Korea regarding COVID. We have an amazing opportunity to set up something that starts with health, but it has to be multilateral. So the question is, what is required for North Koreans to come to the table, right? And not just a health representative. It starts with health. Whatever the mechanism is, Koreans to a dialogue, it has to have sufficient sufficient backbone to be able to go beyond health and be able to liaise with South Korea, U.S., Japan, China, Russia. So the key here is going to be, how do we set that up? But it has to be I think the COVID-19 and pandemic preparedness and the vaccine is a good place to start this dialogue. But it has to have those tentacles that allow eventual, the progression into diplomatic discussions.
Now, Obi, let me turn to the China-U.S. relations. Obi, don't you see any role to be played by Japan, South Korea, Australia, ASEAN countries to bring China and the U.S. together? We hate the revival of old Cold War, because if we have a new Cold War, we cannot go to North Korea, we cannot go to China, we cannot go to Russia. We become the crippled peninsula state. Therefore, we Koreans hate Korean division, Korean War, protracted military conflict are all the product of Cold War. How can we avoid Cold War? What role can we play?
Well, actually, I think that's a very good question. I think countries like Korea are caught in the middle, just as the ASEAN countries also find themselves caught in the middle. They don't want to have to decide for one side or the other. You're trapped in between two grinding tectonic plates. So I think that should stress upon you a role that you could play as you are right now, but you try to both bring the major players, in this case it would be China and the United States, but increasingly it's China and India, China and Australia, China and Canada, China and Sweden. China has alienated all of these countries in ways that I think do beg some sort of counseling. So Korea could play that role, as could Singapore, as could other countries who find themselves literally stuck in the middle. Because I think it is probably an ineluctable trend, inescapable trend, that the middle is going to disappear. And Korea is going to be trapped. So you might as well try to make the best arrangement you can to try to keep that contradiction conforming in every way you possibly can, or you will be forced, I think, to decide, at least if present trends continue. Think of what would happen if there was even a very modest clash in the South China Sea. Some move on Taiwan, or the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyuda, where suddenly China made a move. I mean, it would then create oil and water sort of situation separating, and Korea then, I think, would really be pushed in ways that it doesn't want to be pushed and has avoided to the present. So I think that role is one that you could play much more actively, much more aggressively. There's almost a neutral power.
Richard, okay, I'm being saddened by, obvious, very pessimistic projection of a power trend in this part of the world. Richard, do you agree with, okay, let me ask Richard first, and then Kevin and Melly, okay? And then Stein.
Okay, I'll be quick. I think you can look at it in the opposite way in some respects from Orwell. It's either the end of middle powers or it should be a golden age of agency for middle powers, because particularly allies with the United States, because if the US is doing less, other countries have to do more. At another forum, at another time, I would like to hear South Koreans talk a little bit more about South Korea's relationship with China. This is your neighbor. This is a neighbor who has imposed sanctions on you over THAAD. You had a negotiated settlement of that. I think the South Korean-China relationship is very interesting, and I think one that many other countries are watching to see how South Korea holds its own in that relationship.
Okay, Kevin?
2 points. One is that in total, one of the things that the board has just agreed to do is to begin developing a new study group on building trust, confidence building, and regional security mechanisms in Northeast Asia. And so we'd be very open to kind of collaborating with any other of the groups and organizations that are represented here on that venture, so that we can begin thinking very systematically about what's needed right now in this particular context. But an issue which I think we've been skirting and needs to be put very firmly on the table has to do with the divided West itself. One of the sobering, and I think that until we, in a sense, come to terms with the divisions that exist within the West and the whole Western project, it's going to be very challenging for us to kind of think about alternative relationships with China or with other parts of Southeast Asia, for that matter. One of the alarming things about the last election was that 71 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, even though he's arguably the most corrupt, least democratic, most autocratic, and most ineffective president of recent time. Now, what does that say about the kind of Western project and Western democracy? So I think there's a whole issue here around the nature of the democratic project itself and what that means in terms of these sorting out other relationships with countries that have no pretension of being democratic. And I think this is one of the biggest issues that we really have to face, which has to do with the whole question of dialogue within the West, really, within and between different Western countries about the nature of the relationships we wish to have with rising Asia.
Okay. I will give 2 minutes to Melly, okay, and then Stein, and then Musaya and Charles. and Jenny.
Yeah.
Okay?
Thank you. before we could get sort of too pessimistic about the future of the world in light of this kind of 21st century challenges that we're facing, I think we should not also overlook the fact that in the midst of all this major power rivalry, there is actually some kind of cooperation on a technical basis. And in this particular instance, I'm talking about health cooperation. Within the East, ASEAN plus 3 framework, there's been a long history of health cooperation in highly pathogenic diseases. And Korea was a major player in that, and so is Japan and China. And when it comes to, encouraging transparency in disease reporting, etc., there has been a history of China after SARS, right, coming and engaging with its +2 Northeast Asian neighbors and 10 ASEAN countries in actually disease reporting. And that is why, as a matter of record, some ASEAN countries, ASEAN officials have said that as early as January, there was a lot of communication. And that, in a way, helped them in disease pandemic preparedness and response. So the long and short of what I'm saying is there is something that you can build on multilateral institutions in the region that in hopefully, with China can also bring in some way or other in North Korea. And when you look at some of the areas that they're cooperating now, for example, vaccine production and distribution, this is now the kind of discussion that's taking place concretely in the region. So, you already have this low-hanging fruit, so to speak, areas in functional cooperation that will mitigate existing major power cooperation. So I don't think we should overlook that. And my plea is to pay attention to these areas because these are the incremental steps that you can take to help promote health security and the wider security in the region, and in the process of doing so, actually contribute to peace.
Thank you. Stein, Charles, and Jenny.
I think it's essential for us to keep channels open into China with our friends and colleagues in China, and I think this is threatened. I understand it's threatened, and I think it's extremely sad what has happened under Xi Jinping. One name that comes up to me all the time is Michael Kovrig, whom I met at conferences in China and in Vietnam, and who then was arrested and has now been in prison for 2 years as a Canadian citizen formerly working for the International Crisis Group. But in spite of that, I still must up that contact. Also, I think that Orville, I don't think the middle will disappear. I think there are so many countries that are deeply integrated with China economically and through technology transfer, so a kind of traditional Cold War would not work. I have attended in the last week, first one conference on the South China Sea in Hainan and then one in Hanoi. And at both these conferences, there are still Vietnamese and Chinese and Filipinos talking with each other. At the conference in China, there was a proposal to set up something on the model of the Arctic Council, and this came from a Chinese professor. At the meeting in Vietnam, there was much constructive talk about possible fishery cooperation as a way of developing cooperation in a very difficult situation in the South China Sea. All these positive kinds of proposals are also deeply held by people in China. We cannot criticize Xi Jinping because that's impossible. But we think differently, and I'm absolutely sure at the back of my mind they are happy with Xi Jinping's leadership. Thank you.
Charles?
Did you call on me? I had 3 quick points. First is, how do small powers and middle-sized powers affect large power relationships? And the main way is through your systemic positioning. So if one large power is misbehaving, you shift this way. If another large power is misbehaving, you shift the other way. And normally, large powers pay attention to that. But what we don't know is whether either China or the United States would pay attention to it. But that's the normal way. Secondly, I think this municipal avenue is a very important one to work on. I noticed that Seoul has one of the widest networks of sister city relations in the world. And those sister city relationships include Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Tokyo and many other national capitals, of course. And so this is a kind of network that potentially could be leveraged in something. Unfortunately, there's no relationship with Pyongyang, but Pyongyang and Seoul overlap in 3 relationships. Then I think another thing is to look at the North Pacific, not as a regional organization, but as an analytical framework for looking at some of these problems. I'm sorry for Southeast Asians, but for the moment, I think you need a smaller multilateral group that includes 3 largest economies in the world, most of the nuclear powers in the world, but only 7 countries. And so you can have rather rich discussions within that kind of a framework. And finally, I would say, I think that South Korea is disadvantaged vis-a-vis many opportunities toward the North, because the U.S. is no threat to the North. China is no threat to the North. But South Korea, in a sense, is a much more fundamental threat to the North Korean system, is because you're Koreans.
Jenny?
Well, I just want to generally reflect on the impact that COVID has had on a lot of peace processes around the world, and the mobility restrictions that prevent physical meetings. And I don't think it's possible to underestimate that component because some person-to-person conversations cannot be replaced over Zoom, for instance. So if this is a problem, then I very much agree with other speakers that perhaps it's an opportune avenue to explore public health as a vehicle and to use the work and collaboration around the pandemic as an entry point, while still having a longer transition and being quite persistent, as other speakers have highlighted. Oftentimes there are ups and downs in peace processes, and it may take many, many attempts over numerous decades to get to a favorable outcome. So these would just be my general reflections, and I thank you so much for this fruitful exchange.
Thank you very much. Now, time is up. Therefore, Musaya, okay, Musaya, your last comment. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. My comment is basically that North and South Korea. Is South Korea willing to give up unification or not? Will there be a Ministry of Unification in South Korea? Because if you can accept North Korea as a separate state, then you don't have a problem. But if you want to unify, and then the nature of a unified Korea becomes in question. So all these small projects about doing minor things are not going to help very much, I think, if you don't address the fundamental issue in the North-South divide. You have to address the fundamental issue, it seems to me.
대단히 감사합니다. 이제
Thank you very
시간이
much.
이제 지나서
Because
최종적으로 이제 랩업을 해야 될
are
시간이
behind schedule, I think it's time for us to wrap up. So in our discussions today,
시청자들을 위해서 제가 한국말로 말씀드리겠습니다.
please understand that I'm going to wrap up in the Korean language for our Korean audiences. So first of all, I think there was a lot of debate on the concepts, because on peace and security, Professor Mathaya said that we have to think about this in terms of security studies. He was very in the minds of realpolitik, whereas other professors, including Professor Kevin, I think in Oslo and Stockholm, they said that there is still much value to be placed on peace studies. And then there's the issue of should we go towards passive or a negative or positive peace. and also security. I think these are all very conceptual discussions. So this will continue on, obviously, until next year, because the Seoul Peace Forum is going to be slated to open in October, and we can continue on our discussions then. Secondly, we also talked about the COVID-19 pandemic, because right now in the Asia-Pacific region, it's almost like opening Pandora's box. As Dr. Orville Schell and Richard McGregor have mentioned, that the U.S. and China dispute, as long as this dispute is ongoing, then it's going to be very difficult for us to see permanent peace in the region, that these major power politics is really going to continue to be a security risk to the Asia-Pacific region. What are we going to do about that? And obviously, we still have to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. As Peter Hayes, professor, said, that there is also the issue of WMD, climate change. For many Asian countries, as Professor Muthaya Alagapat talked about, there is this issue of nation states, this idea of Westphalian sovereignty. And then there's the issue of North Korean nuclear weapons. So there are all of these different challenges that exist in our region. How do we respond to these issues right now? And I think that we had that discussion about the different approaches we could take next year when we have the Seoul Peace Forum. We can discuss the different approaches that we could take to these various different issues, whether they be dispute-related or not. And thirdly, on what is to be done, we heard from Professor Jonathan Powell that this Shangri-La Security Dialogue is attended by sitting defense ministers. But for the Asia-Pacific region, we also need a separate, perhaps an Olympiad for theorists and scholars of peace studies, that maybe Seoul can take the lead to create this forum for dialogue for leading peace thinkers and peace theorists. And different local governments can send in Tokyo, Beijing, Seoul, these different metropolitan regions can work together in that regard as well. Maybe a Center for Conflict Resolution, for example, can be organized here in Seoul, and that could be very meaningful. As Jen Lee mentioned in her remarks, that this pandemic is a big challenge and a curse. But at the same time, this is also providing us with some room for opportunity, that we can maybe take use of this to try to bring North Korea to the table and engage in cooperation with DPRK, so we can maybe provide assistance to the DPRK, perhaps in the welfare, in the public health sector, as Dr. Kee Park said. And the pandemic can be a way for us to build trust and lower tension and ultimately go towards the road for peace. There are many different comments that were raised, and although this was not explicitly discussed today, when we do host the Seoul Peace Forum next year, there will obviously be talk about the Olympics. Through the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics of 2018, we explore possibilities for peace between the two Koreas. Next year, August, there's going to be the Tokyo Olympics, and then after that, it's going to be followed directly by the Beijing Winter Olympics. Seoul is working to host the 2032 Olympics together with Pyongyang. It's difficult for us to meet with Pyongyang counterparts because of COVID-19, but Seoul's intention is to host the 2032 Summer Olympics together with Pyongyang. Seoul and Pyongyang will be co-hosts of the 2032 Olympics. The IOC is very receptive of this idea, but this is an area for us to build trust in a completely new sector. Thank you very much for your participation, and we hope to meet you in person next year in October at Seoul Peace Forum. As Jen Lee mentioned, we need to have these face-to-face interactions. Face-to-face interactions and virtual interactions are so vastly different. Humans really thrive on physical touch. We need to sit down, share a meal, share drinks, and engage in heated discussions face-to-face, which really strengthens the bonds between us. So going forward with the Seoul Institute and the Center, these 13 institutions and think tanks can engage in cooperation to try to go towards peace and more security, that this can allow us to engage in more synergy. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, and good night to you all.
네, 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. There was a nice wrap-up by Dr. Moon.
All the presenters and the moderator, Moon, for being with us today. Through the 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue, we determined changing risk factors and discussed many ways of securing individuals' safe and peaceful lives. Next year, we will host the first Seoul Peace Forum, where peace researchers, governments, and civil society practitioners will gather together to overcome war, build peace, and discuss the future altogether. Again, let me express my gratitude to all the concerned and presenters in the studio for being with us today. Thank you very much for watching 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much. Thank you.